Perhaps the most interesting story of them all, Zana from Russia, an Alma. Remember I told you that the Almas were also man-sized, 5 to 7 feet tall, 300, 600 pounds, and they're dominant in Russia and the Orient? This is Alma, the living Neanderthal. This is one of them right here. This is Zana, is an Alma, was an Alma. Now, understand this. In the Orient, the tradition when one of these things is captured, for whatever reason, was to kill it immediately. Desiccate its body and sell its body parts for medicine, principally aphrodisiacs. That's the Oriental tradition. In the Russian area, though, when they would be captured, male or female, they would be used as slaves. Physical slaves, held, spirits broken in these primitive villages where they would be, and they would be used to carry wood, fetch water, do the haying, all the heavy work nobody really wants to do. Make the slave do it. And so that became their fate. And for females, another aspect of it was they had to become the sex slaves of the men of the area. And that was one of the other great advantages to having a female. And so this is the fate that befell Zana in about 1850. She was captured as an adult in 1850. We do not know how old she was. She was an adult. She was taken to the village of Takina, where they kept her in a hole for about 3 years until her spirit was broken enough to let her wander around. She was dependent on them for food, and then they began to train her to fetch wood, fetch water, do the things that she had to do. And she became like the village pet for 40 years. She died in 1890. Now, how do we know this? Because in the Orient and Russia, they don't have the same tradition that we have. They're very old countries. They've been living with this for a very long time, for centuries. They know they're real. They send researchers out taking information about it. They send teams out trying to find them, or they used to when Russia had money. They don't now. But this was done in the mid-1970s. Excuse me, I'm sorry, mid-1960s. This research was done in the mid-60s. So, in the mid-1960s, this is an area of Kazakhstan where she lived, where people live very long lives. You know those places in the world where people live up around 120 years old? So they had over 100 people above the age of 80 that had known her quite well in their youth. There were 10 still alive who had attended her funeral. So they were able to get tremendous corroborative evidence, corroborative testimony about her lifestyle, and everything about her from all these different people, so we have an amazing view of what she was like and what her life was like. Again, a lot of which I go over in the book. But the main thing is that she never learned to speak, but she learned the language. They could talk to her and she'd know what they meant. And while there, she gave birth 8 times to hybrids with men of the village. 8 times. Killed the first 4 accidentally because her kind apparently washes the newborn off immediately. She would take it to the freezing glacial river that ran through the village, and because they had so much human in them, it would kill them. So the last 4, the village women took them from her at birth and raised them on their own because they looked so human. And every pair of hands was very valuable in one of those primitive villages like that. And so they raised them up, and they became Russian citizens. Married, had children. Her great-grandchildren are alive in Russia to this day. I know, it's an amazing story. Now, what do people say about her children? Well, everybody said that they were indeed taller than most, bigger than most, a little more robust than most, but not giants, not superhumans, just strong, you know, big and strong people. Darker skinned than most, but not truly negroid. Hair like, you know, everybody, but not covered in hair like she was. Average intelligence, not wizards, not stupid. Ugly enough to make a freight train take a dirt road. Unfortunately for them. But they could speak. That's the key. They could all speak. They had very high-pitched voices, but they could speak, which allowed them to integrate into the community as humans, even though they were clearly not quite humans. So the researchers were real excited to get all this information. It's like, wow. And they knew where she was buried. She was buried in the village cemetery. Unfortunately, this is a Muslim area. They don't mark gravestones there. So they knew she was in the village cemetery, which had existed for centuries, and they couldn't say just where because of the 10 people that were alive. They all had different memories of where it had been. Who knew that 70, 80 years later somebody was going to care? So they couldn't decide. They couldn't, and they would have had to bulldoze the whole thing. Village wouldn't let them do that. So somebody says, well, guess what? Her youngest son, Kvit, died in 1954, only 10 years prior to this study. So they said, we know where he is. We'll let you dig him up. So, boy, they dug him up. Her youngest son, Kvit. Now, before we look at his skull, I want to say again, remember, Neanderthals had bigger brains than we did, and they carry them, we do rather, than they carry them in a bun in the back of their head called the occipital bun. All right, let's take a look at Kvit's skull. Here you go, right here. Notice, if you will, that's a remnant of an occipital bun right there. Notice how much of a forehead he doesn't have. Look at the size of these brow ridges. Look at that eye socket. Is it starting to look familiar? Look at the size of that nasal passage. Look at the size of these teeth. Look at the size of that jawbone. Look at the size of the cheekbone. But look at that chin. Allows him to speak. This is an ugly dude, kids. This is a Neanderthal, basically. This is a guy you do not want to meet in a dark alley. Now, what, of course, anthropologists say is that he is an extreme variation on the human norm. An extreme, real extreme variation on the human norm. But that's how they explain it.